morning, and welcome to this week's edition of Marquette in Motion. We're your hosts, Hallie Kilberg
and Miranda Peters. We've got a special show for you today, and we can't wait to get started.
What makes today's show so special, you may ask? Well, this past Monday, State Representative Andy McKeon visited Marquette.
And Marquette in Motion was lucky enough that Mr. McKeon took some time out of his busy schedule to let us interview him.
He had much wisdom to share, and we didn't want you to miss any of it. So in segment 1, we'll have the first part of that interview.
Then in segment 2, Justina will be talking about the Jan Richardson Conference that some of our elementary teachers recently attended.
Jeb and Garrett will be here, as always, with the sports report.
Then in segment 3, Hallie, Jeb, and I will be here along with a former Marquette in Motion reporter, Brooklyn Moore, continuing our interview with Mr. McKeon.
And finally, Macy and Amy will round out the show by looking ahead.
Now let's go to the round table for our interview with Mr. Andy McKeon, a Republican member of the Iowa House of Representatives representing District 58. Luke, take it away.
Hello listeners, this is Luke Keys for Meet Marquette. You're listening to Marquette in Motion. Today we have a very special guest, Representative Andy McKeon. I'm joined here by my other co-host, Miranda Peters, Hallie Kilberg, Jeb Schwager, and a former Marquette in Motion interviewer, Brooklyn Moore. We will all be asking Mr. McKeon questions, and we will be listening to his response.
So, you have been involved in politics since 1978 when you were elected in the Iowa House of Representatives. In 1992, you became an Iowa senator for 10 years. Then, for nearly 15 years, you left the political arena. So, Mr. McKeon, we are wondering why you decided to venture into politics again and what just basically brought you back in.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And first of all, I just want to say how glad I am to be here. And I think it's just terrific that you have this opportunity here at Marquette to do these kind of interview shows. I think it's just great. And I understand Governor Reynolds was here earlier this year. And Mr. Kaiser was telling me that with 2020 coming along, you're going to have a whole bunch of presidential candidates. So who knows? Listen, Iowa, is the first caucus state, and so it draws a lot of national attention. And I'll bet you a wooden cookie, you'll have a lot of presidential candidates who want to come down here and be interviewed. But now to answer your question, now that I've had time to think about it. I did retire in 2002 after being in the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate, and I fully expected not to ever be back in politics again. I retired because our kids were just entering high school, and I wanted to be home with them and during those high school years. And I also had a law practice in Anamosa that kept me pretty busy. Well, years went by, and in 2015 I retired from my law practice, and I fully expected that my wife and I would enjoy some very peaceful retirement years. maybe go down south in the winter, or who knows what. Florida. But as it turned out, one day I was out having supper with my wife at a restaurant in Anamosa, and a fella came up to me and he said, Andy, I sure miss having you in the legislature. And I said, well, I appreciate that. And he said, why don't you run again? And I said, well, I'd need a new wife if I was going to run again.
Oh my God.
And he laughed, and I said, and furthermore, I'm perfectly happy with the people we have in there now, and no reason for me to run. And he said, well, haven't you heard? Brian Moore was the local legislator from Bellevue. Brian Moore announced he was retiring, so there's going to be an open seat. And I said, well, thanks a lot. I appreciate your kind remarks, but don't think I'm going to. And then I thought about it more and more, and I began thinking, when I was serving the legislature before, I was so busy with a young family and a law practice, and I said, it would be kind of interesting to go back now when I'm retired from my law practice and I don't have a young family to raise, and I could really throw myself into some of these issues. And I also felt that the political climate had gotten so contentious and partisan. I was hoping that maybe I could be a voice for a more bipartisan approach to things. But I didn't realize I had to get my wife convinced first. And I remember that night, or then a few nights later, when I kind of decided I was interested, I said to my wife, "What would you think about my returning to politics?" And she said, "You're kidding, aren't you?" And she said, "Why would you want to do that?" She said, "We've been there, we've done that. It's so nasty anymore." And I made the comment to her, and I know it sounds corny, but it's the way I felt. I said, "Connie, if everybody who felt that way chooses not to run, it's just going to get that much worse." And I said, we need to have people who want to get in there for the right reasons, and not just because they believe in one party, but because they just want to do a good job and work with everybody. So at any rate, she agreed, and so I've been back there now this will be my third year coming up in January. So that's a very long answer to your question.
No, it's perfect, and we're glad to have you back.
Now, Mr. McKean, in 2017, you served as a vice chair for the Iowa Environmental Protection Committee. There has been a lot in the news recently about climate change and that people are concerned that humans are the cause. What do you hope was accomplished during your time on this committee?
Well, unfortunately, the Environmental Protection Committee did very little concerning the whole issue of climate change. And I think it's very unfortunate. It's really, in many ways, more of a federal issue. But in my opinion, after taking a look at a lot of the scientific information, I personally am convinced that human behavior does have a very direct impact on climate change. And I think it's about time that our national leaders, including our president, reaches the same conclusion instead of just denying it. I thought the Paris Accord, where all the countries were going to work to try to decrease their carbon footprint to some degree, at least as a first step, was very, very important. And I think it's a very sad state of affairs that our country is dropping out of that accord. And I'm hoping that we'll see a change in direction in that regard. But getting back to the Environmental Protection Committee, this is not exactly on point, but one thing that I worked on in that area is to help expand our bottle bill in the state of Iowa. We're one of maybe about 10 states in the country that requires a deposit when you buy soft drink or beer at the grocery store. And I think it's made our ditches a lot cleaner, and it's been extremely good for our environment. And last year I introduced legislation with 41 co-sponsors to expand the bottle bill to also include the water containers, fruit juices, teas, and energy drinks. And I think that would go a long way in cleaning up our environment and would be good for rural economic development as well. Unfortunately, and one of the things you learn when you're in politics is you don't always win. And we didn't get that out of committee, but it's something I plan to be working on again this upcoming year. I think the public is strongly behind it.
All right, next question is, you were recently appointed to serve as the chair of the Ethics Committee. We believe that this is an important job, and we're glad you'll be leading the charge. Do you feel that your faith will help you to be successful in this role?
Yes, I think it's very important that all of us learn how to translate our faith into constructive, practical action in our daily lives, and I'm hoping that the basic tenets of our faith, whether it's Christian, Protestant, Jewish, or whatever the case might be, that these basic tenets can be reflected in the decisions we make and the choices we make. So I definitely think that the question is a good one, and I certainly hope that my faith can be translated into the work I do in the area of ethics.
It seems that Washington becomes more and more divided in each passing year by partisan politics. You said yourself that you want to try to take a more bipartisan role in politics? And do you think that this partisanship is happening in Iowa specifically? And how do you think politics can become more bipartisan?
Well, unfortunately, I think politics is getting more and more partisan. Not only at the national level, where it's almost unworkable, but in Iowa as well. And I can tell you this, when I first was elected 40 years ago, it was a very congenial place where Democrats and Republicans worked together. There was not an enormous divide between the two parties. And when I came back after being retired for 15 years, it was a very, very different place. It's extremely partisan, extremely rigid, very contentious, and it gets in the way of good legislation being passed. I honestly been knocking my head against the wall to think about how we could improve the situation, because every year people claim that they want to be bipartisan and work together, and then when they get down there, it's the same old deal. So I really don't. I just wish I had a good answer for you. One bill that I introduced last year, I should say, which I plan to reintroduce, that I think would be a small step in the right direction, is to make our county races for supervisor, for sheriff, for recorder, for auditor, to make those nonpartisan. Because at least that would slow down the partisanship at the local level, and maybe would begin to work its way up to the higher offices. And I also think another part of the problem is the tremendous influence of big money in politics. And what happens is that various special interest groups give lots of money to one party or another, and then the party feels a certain obligation to do their bidding and try to get their members on board on those particular issues, and I think that gets in the way of bipartisanship as well. So I would like to see some definite limitations on how much money can be spent in some of these campaigns. Believe it or not, right here in our district, I don't know if you followed it or not, but Senator Bowman was our local senator from Maquoketa, and he was challenged by Carrie Kelker from Dyersville. And she actually was successful in unseating him. And it's my understanding that between his campaign and her campaign, that over $1.3 million was spent. Can you believe it? $1.3 million on a state Senate seat that pays $25,000 a year, by the way. So you kind of wonder, why is there so much money going into these races, and what do people expect in exchange for their money? So I definitely would like to see some way to kind of reduce this terrible obscene spending that's going on. I think if we could have used that $1.3 million to on projects right here in Jackson County, think of the good we could have done.
We could have done so much
for that money, but it's all went up in smoke, on the TV. Yeah.
So speaking of being on different sides of the aisle, the Republican majority in the House of Representatives expanded from 57 to 59 members out of 100 in 2018. Yet nationally, Democrats gained at least 27 seats and now make up the majority of the House in Washington. Why do you think Iowa voters voted the way they did, expanding the majority of Republicans, while the country voted to give Democrats control?
Well, that's a very good question. I think on the federal level, I think there was a strong feeling on the part of many people that we needed to have more of a balance of power, that the Republicans were controlling not only the presidency, but the House and the Senate. And I think there was growing dissatisfaction with some of President Trump's policies, and I think there was a feeling that there needed to be an opportunity to have a little checks and balances. So I think that was part of what happened at the national level. At the state level, actually in Iowa, it was kind of a mixed bag, because Abby Finkenauer was elected to Congress from our district here, Democrat, and she beat Rod Blum, the Republican incumbent. And in the Des Moines area, Cindy Axney unseated the Republican congressman. So the Democrats made some real gains there. And then in the legislature, actually, Democrats made some gains in the Iowa House. The margin now is 53 as opposed to 59. So, but still the Republicans maintain control. And I think partially it was due to the fact that I think at the legislative level in Iowa, which is a smaller state, the districts are fairly small. People really get to know their candidates, and I think it all boils down to how good the candidates are and how effective their campaigns are. But it is interesting that there was much more of a swing nationally toward the Democrats than there was in Iowa.
Thanks, Mr. McKeon, and now for a little intermission. Listeners, stay tuned. We'll have more of our interview with Andy McKeon in segment 3, and we have a great segment 2 coming up next. Don't go away. More Marquette in Motion after the break.
Welcome back to Marquette in Motion. Here now is Justina Denlinger informing us on the Jan Richardson Conference.
On Tuesday, first grade teacher Miss Katie Kiefer and second grade teacher Miss Becca Draus traveled to Fenimore, Wisconsin to attend a reading conference led by guided reading guru Jan Richardson. The following day, fourth grade teacher Mrs. Jenny Outman and fifth grade teacher Mr. Eric Peterson attended another of Richardson's reading conferences. However, this one focused on guided reading as it applies to the intermediate grades. Jan Richardson is the author of Next Steps in Guided Reading. She is extremely well known and respected in the education world, and our teachers had a chance to listen to her speak and converse with her regarding the best practices in guided reading. Here's what some of the teachers had to say about the day.
Hi, I am Miss Katie Kiefer, and I really enjoyed our day at the Jan Richardson Reading Conference. I learned so much about guided reading and different components that I can implement into my classroom, and I'm already implementing them, and I can't wait to go again in March so I can learn even more about the writing part of it.
I'm Mrs. Upman. I also went to the Jan Richardson Conference in Fenimore, Wisconsin. I attended for the transitional and the fluent part of guided reading, and we learned a lot about how to reach the high students and the lower students and to meet everybody at their individual needs.
Now, our elementary teachers are fortunate enough to have another opportunity to meet with Jan Richardson as they attend part 2 of this conference, which will be held in the spring. For Marquette in Motion, this has been Justina Denlinger.
Thanks, Justina. And now let's spring right into the sports report. Here are Jeb and Garrett.
Thanks, girls. To begin this week in sports, we'll finish out last week's results. Last Friday, December 7th, the basketball teams traveled to take on Northland at Troy Mills.
On this evening, the extremely talented Northland team swept the Mohawks.
Despite the losses, the Marquette teams looked to the upside, using this to come back even stronger the next day, December 8th, against Edgewood Colesburg.
Here, the JV girls started the home quad off with a win, while the JV boys came just short of a comeback win in the end.
At 6 o'clock with varsity action, Tori Mickle led the girls team to a 57-26 win with her 22 points, 11 rebounds, and 6 blocks.
The varsity boys saw a much tighter game, losing in the end by a score of 56-48. This came despite Danny Koos's 21 points, 10 rebounds, and 6 blocks.
Moving into this past week, on Tuesday, December 11th, Marquette took home court again against the Lisbon Lions.
This action began at 4:30 with the JV boys, as Lisbon did not have a JV girls team. The Marquette JV boys, however, were outsized in this match and fell just short of a victory.
Next came varsity action, beginning with the girls, who put up a 60-33 win. They were led by Tiana Richmond with 15 points and 6 rebounds.
Last but not least was the varsity boys, who came roaring into this game against the Lions, looking to pick up their first win in their first conference game of the season.
The game started out close, with Marquette leading by just 1 point at half, but the Mohawks pulled away in the end, getting their first win of the season with a score of 46-32.
This wouldn't have been possible without Ty Parker's fantastic night, notching 9 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists, and 5 steals.
Marquette finished out the week on the road against Midland yesterday, December 14th. Those results will be in next week's edition. For Marquette in Motion, this has been Jeb Schwager
and Garrett Krieg
with your Marquette Sports Report.
Thanks, guys. Don't go away, listeners. We'll be back with more Marquette in Motion after a word from our sponsors.
Welcome back to Marquette in Motion. Now let's continue our interview with Mr. Andy McKeon.
Many teenagers have a presence in social media. In late September, you announced that you were leaving Facebook and then returned 3 weeks later. Can you tell us what led you to make the decision to leave Facebook, and then why did you decide to return?
Well, my wife says I'm turning into an old curmudgeon, but oh
no.
I tell you, Facebook. I know there's some very positive things about it. It allows people to get in touch and to communicate. But I was getting so concerned by all the negativity I was seeing on Facebook, and the very crude comments being made, not directed at me necessarily, but just overall. It was, and I think what really upset me was during the Kavanaugh hearings for Supreme Court. Both sides the comments that were so vile, either for him or against him, and it just kind of soured me, and I just didn't feel like being exposed to it. I think there are a lot of people. There's some interesting research that there are a lot of people who are suffering from various forms of depression by being on Facebook too much. I also, this doesn't really have to do much with politics, but I also think that for many people whose lives aren't quite what they want them to be, or who are lonesome, or who are going through difficulties, they look on Facebook, everybody's having a wonderful time, they're going on great vacations, or this and that, and I think it can be a very hurtful and depressing thing for people who aren't going through a tough time in their life. So at any rate, I said to myself, I'd just like to be free of it for a while. So I announced that I was getting off. I got all kinds of people. I got a lot of interesting comments. Did you see some of them? But people were mostly saying, I feel kind of the same way too. I'm not sure if it's such a great idea. And then after I was off for a few weeks, I had more and more people from around my district saying, well, Andy, why don't you just get back on and just continue doing the positive kind of posts you do about good things that are happening in the district, and make it a force for good. And it's a great way for us to know some of the things you're working on in the legislature. So I gave it some more thought, and I decided to get back on after a few weeks. And I'm just limiting it to positive things that are going on in the district, maybe a little bit of positive things in my family, and I plan to do a nice post about my trip to Marquette today. So
woohoo, we made it! I'm looking for that.
In fact, before I leave, I want to get a picture of all of you guys. Get it on there. But I guess like so many other things that are a force for good, they can be, but they can also be abused, and we're seeing a lot of abuse there too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mr. McKean, high schoolers have a lot of options for careers, but preparations for those future careers start early. If a student, like me, was considering to be a politician, what advice would you have for them as they are going through high school?
I think the best advice that I could give for anybody who's interested in politics as a career is, number one, to do a lot of reading. In fact, when I tell young parents what's the best thing you can do with your kids is have them learn how to love to read, because that's how you really broaden your horizons. And then I would try to get involved in some local issue in your area that you can kind of follow through and see just how the process works and where the pressure points are. And then also, if there's some candidate who's running for a higher office, whether it be the legislature or the governorship or Congress, volunteer to be on their campaign and learn a little bit about what the campaigning experience is all about. And by the way, if any of you would like to come and spend a day with me in Des Moines this session, I'd love to have you come. So consider that. But those are a few of the things I would recommend.
We know you have a lot of things that keep you busy at work. Away from work, you have family, nature, and square dancing. Would you share with us what interests and people bring you the most joy?
Well, I've recently become a grandfather, and I know you're all a long way from that, but you haven't even had the phase of having a spouse and children yet. But there's something about having grandchildren that is just sort of incomparable. It's just a wonderful, wonderful experience. So I just spent the weekend down in Illinois, Petersburg, Illinois, with our son and daughter-in-law, and they have two little girls. One turned 5 and one turned 1 this past weekend. We had a great time, and it's just pure happiness. I also love music. I've played old-fashioned country and gospel music since I was a youngster, and play piano and violin and guitar.
I actually saw you play the piano one time. Very good.
and so I get a lot of pleasure doing that. Call square dances and have a little band, and we travel around and play at different events. And then I love the beauty of God's creation. We live on an acreage. We have 40 acres on the edge of Anamosa. Live in a big old house and have all kinds of trees and prairie garden and vegetable garden, and I get lots of pleasure from that.
Speaking of joy, Christmas is the most wonderful time of year, and it's almost upon us. Do you have any Christmas traditions unique to the McKean family, or do you have any special holiday plans this holiday?
Well, again, I hope to see as much of our grandchildren as I can. We have three little girls, and we always, for us, our special Christmas time is Christmas Eve. We just love opening our presents after Christmas Eve service and coming home and around the tree and having a good time together.
Okay, well, Mr. McEwen, thank you so much for being with us today. For Marquette in Motion, this has been Hallie Kilberg.
And Miranda Peters.
Jeb Schwager.
Brooklyn Moore.
And Luke Keys. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. McKean.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being so kind and gentle with me. I appreciate it.
Now, time for the real questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. McKean, for that great interview. Now here are Macy and Amy looking ahead.
Monday, December 17th is the 6th through 12th grade music concert in St. Joseph's Church beginning at 7 p.m.
On Tuesday, there is a JV varsity boys basketball game at 6 p.m. at West Carroll High School.
On Friday, December 21st, there is a quad basketball game at home versus Cowee with JV girls beginning at 4:30 and varsity beginning at 6.
For Looking Ahead, this has been Macy Kramer
and Amy Sieverding for Marquette in Motion.
Thanks, girls. And just as Mr. McKeon shared his Christmas traditions, we'd like to thank you for making us one of your Saturday traditions.
For Marquette in Motion, this has been Miranda Peters
and Hallie Kilberg.
And remember, stay informed,
stay involved,
stay in motion.